The morning I wrapped a goodbye gift, I still believed leaving was the kindest thing two women could do for each other. I just did not know the gift was meant for someone I had not even met. My name is Evelyn Carter. I was 54 years old, and 10 days before Christmas I stood alone inside Carter Christmas house, surrounded by hundreds of handmade ornaments that no longer felt like they belonged to me. The little wooden angels, painted stars, carved snowflakes, and delicate glass bells still covered every shelf exactly as my mother had arranged them for years. Customers always said the store felt warm the moment they stepped inside. They smelled cinnamon, fresh pine, and cedar before they noticed anything else. I smelled memories. Sometimes memories are colder than winter. 18 months had passed since my mother died. 2 years had passed since my husband quietly admitted he had fallen in love with someone else after 26 years of marriage. He did not leave with shouting or slammed doors. He left with careful apologies and neatly packed boxes, which somehow hurt more. Since then, every morning had followed the same pattern. I unlocked the front door, switched on the Christmas lights, dusted ornaments that nobody bought anymore, smiled politely at tourists, and climbed the narrow staircase each evening to an apartment that had become far too quiet. People called me strong. They mistook routine for strength. On the front counter rested a thick envelope from a real estate developer in Portland. He wanted to buy the entire property after Christmas. The old Victorian house, the workshop, the storefront, everything. He promised to preserve its history, although I had learned long ago that promises printed on expensive paper often disappeared faster than ink. I had almost decided to sign. I told myself I was being practical. A woman living alone did not need a building this large. A business that survived on holiday shoppers could not survive forever. At least that was what I repeated whenever guilt began sounding too much like my mother's voice. She used to tell me that every ornament carried a little piece of the hands that made it. That was why she never rushed. She believed love could be carved into wood if someone was patient enough. After she passed away, I never finished another original design. One unfinished angel remained on my workbench upstairs, waiting beneath a cloth covered with fine sawdust. I had started carving it the week before my mother became ill. I never touched it again. She once smiled at that unfinished angel and said, "Do not complete her until you know which life truly belongs to you." I laughed back then because I thought I already knew. Looking at it now, I realized I had spent years living someone else's version of my future. Outside, snow drifted gently across the quiet streets of Bellwether, Maine. Christmas wreaths hung from every porch, and children pulled sleds toward the hill overlooking the harbor. Everything looked exactly as it always had, only I had changed. I reached for the developer's contract, picked up my pen and took one slow breath. Before the tip touched the paper, a sharp cracking sound echoed from somewhere above the workshop ceiling. I froze. Another crack followed, louder this time. Then icy water burst through the old ceiling, splashing across the work table where the unfinished angel had waited all those silent months. I dropped the contract and ran toward the workshop, watching cold water pour over carved wood, scattered sketches, and the last piece of my mother's unfinished dream, while a strange feeling settled inside me that this house was not simply falling apart. It was asking me one final time whether I was ready to let it go. Cold water spread across the workshop floor faster than I could think. I grabbed every towel within reach, but the stream pouring through the cracked ceiling ignored every desperate attempt to slow it down. Wooden ornaments floated against chair legs. Sketches my mother had drawn decades earlier curled at the edges as the paper absorbed the icy water. My unfinished angel lay on the workbench beneath the leaking pipe, her carved face still untouched, her wings still rough blocks of cedar waiting for careful hands that had lost their confidence long ago. I reached her just before another burst of water splashed across the table. I wrapped her inside an old linen cloth and carried her into the front showroom as though I were carrying something alive. By the time I returned, the workshop floor was covered in nearly 2 inches of freezing water. My fingers were numb before I managed to shut off the main water valve in the basement. The silence afterward felt almost frightening. The only sound left was water dripping steadily from broken plaster onto worn wooden floorboards. I stood there breathing hard, staring at the ceiling, wondering whether this old house had finally decided it could no longer carry both its own weight and mine. I called the town building office first, then my insurance company, then a local plumber. Christmas week had already stretched every schedule beyond reason. The plumber apologized and said he could stop the leak later that afternoon, but structural damage would require specialists. The insurance representative spoke kindly, asking careful questions before explaining that an emergency restoration assessment would be arranged as quickly as possible because the property was considered a public business. She could not promise immediate repairs, only an inspection. I thanked her even though gratitude felt difficult with soaked boots and shaking hands. Around noon, Daniel Foster, the town building inspector, arrived carrying a flashlight, measuring tape, and a clipboard. He had known my mother for years. His expression changed the moment he stepped into the workshop. He examined the damaged ceiling, tested the weakened flooring, and slowly climbed the staircase leading toward the second-floor storage rooms. When he returned, he removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose before speaking. "Evelyn, I cannot allow customers back inside until this building passes a structural evaluation. The water reached places we cannot safely inspect without a restoration specialist." I nodded because there was nothing else to do. He handed me an official notice explaining that Carter Christmas House would remain temporarily closed. Then he added one sentence that echoed long after he drove away. "Your insurance coverage depends on beginning the emergency assessment before the holiday deadline. You have 9 days. 9 days. The number settled heavily inside me. The developer's contract still rested on the front counter exactly where I had dropped it. Selling the property suddenly looked easier than saving it. That thought frightened me more than the leaking ceiling. Late that afternoon, the plumber repaired the broken pipe, but the damage remained. Portable fans hummed through the workshop while damp cedar filled the air with a rich earthy scent that reminded me of long winters spent carving ornaments beside my mother. As evening settled over Bellwether, I walked through every room, switching off lights one by one until only the display window remained glowing softly toward the snowy street. My phone rang just before I locked the front door. The insurance company had found someone willing to drive from Portland despite the holiday rush. A preservation specialist would arrive the following morning to evaluate the building and prepare a restoration plan. After ending the call, I stood quietly beside the unfinished angel resting on the front counter. For the first time in years, I realized I was no longer waiting for another loss. I was waiting for a stranger whose arrival might decide whether this old house still had a future, or whether it would become one more memory covered by fresh December snow. The next morning arrived wrapped in pale sunlight that reflected across fresh snow until the entire street seemed to glow. Carter Christmas House remained closed, its front door carrying the temporary notice that felt far heavier than a single sheet of paper should. I unlocked the entrance anyway. Habit can be stronger than hope. I switched on the Christmas lights one strand at a time, even though there were no customers waiting outside. My mother used to say that a house deserved to feel loved whether people were watching or not. I repeated those words quietly as I filled a kettle with water for tea. At exactly 10 o'clock, an old dark blue sport utility vehicle stopped in front of the shop. A woman stepped out wearing heavy winter boots, dark jeans, a forest green coat, and a cream wool scarf wrapped loosely around her neck. She paused before walking inside, studying the carved wooden sign above the entrance with an expression that looked less like professional curiosity and more like quiet admiration. When the bell above the door rang, she removed one glove and offered her hand. "I am Natalie Brooks. The insurance company asked me to evaluate the property. You must be Evelyn Carter." Her voice carried the calm confidence of someone who had spent years walking into damaged places without allowing the damage to define what she saw. I shook her hand. Her fingers were warm despite the bitter cold outside. Mine were still chilled from carrying wet boxes the night before. I apologized for the condition of the store. Natalie slowly looked around the room instead of answering immediately. Her eyes lingered on the hand-carved ornaments, the worn hardwood floors, the stained glass above the staircase, and finally the unfinished angel resting on the counter beneath its linen cloth. "This house has been deeply loved," she said softly. "Buildings remember that." Nobody had spoken about Carter Christmas House that way since my mother passed away. Most visitors saw an old business struggling to survive. Natalie somehow noticed the years of care, hidden beneath cracked plaster and damp wood. She unpacked a laser measuring device, a camera, moisture sensors, and a thick notebook already organized with color-coded tabs. She worked carefully, documenting every damaged beam, every water stain, and every weakened section of flooring. She never hurried. Several times she rested her hand lightly against old cedar walls before writing another note. Eventually curiosity overcame my silence. "Do you always touch the walls before you measure them?" She smiled without looking up. "Wood tells its story before numbers do. If I only study the damage, I miss everything worth saving." The answer stayed with me as we climbed the narrow staircase leading toward my mother's workshop. Natalie paused halfway up, tracing her fingers across the carved banister my grandfather had built almost 60 years earlier. "Most contractors would recommend replacing this," she said. "I would never do that. It only needs reinforcement, not removal." Something inside me relaxed before I realized why. For days I had listened to people talk about replacing, rebuilding, selling, moving on. Natalie was the first person who spoke about preserving. When we reached the workshop, she carefully examined the damaged ceiling before scanning the surrounding walls. After several quiet minutes, she lowered her equipment and looked directly at me. "The structure is stronger than it appears. The broken pipe created serious damage, but the foundation is still solid. This house can absolutely be saved." Relief filled my chest so suddenly I almost laughed. Then she continued, "There is one condition. We need access to a room that has been sealed for many years, because hidden moisture may have spread behind the adjoining walls." I followed her gaze toward a narrow hallway where an old white door remained locked beneath a layer of dust. My heartbeat slowed. That room had belonged to my mother. I had not stepped inside since the afternoon we returned home from the hospital without her. Natalie did not pressure me. She simply waited. Standing there with the old key growing heavier inside my pocket, I realized saving the house might require opening more than damaged walls. My fingers rested on the old brass key for what felt like an entire lifetime before I finally slipped it into the lock. The mechanism resisted at first, as though the door itself had forgotten how to open. Then a quiet click echoed through the hallway. I pushed gently. The scent of cedar, dried pine, and old varnish drifted into the air before the room even came into view. Nothing inside had been touched since the week my mother passed away. Her workbench still stood beneath the tall window overlooking the harbor. Half-filled jars of paint lined narrow shelves. Small carving knives rested exactly where she had left them. A faded apron still hung from the hook beside the door, carrying a fine layer of dust that softened every crease in the fabric. Sunlight filtered through the frosted glass, turning tiny floating particles into glittering specks that looked almost like falling snow. I stopped just inside the doorway, unable to move another step. Natalie remained quietly behind me. She did not rush into the room or begin her inspection. She simply gave me the space to remember. After several long moments, I walked toward the workbench and rested my fingertips against the smooth wooden surface. The marks left by decades of carving were still there beneath my hand. My mother used to stand exactly here every December morning before sunrise, humming softly while shaping angels, stars, and tiny wooden churches. For the first time since losing her, I could almost hear the melody again. Natalie spoke so softly I nearly missed her words. She must have loved creating here. I smiled through eyes that had begun to sting. She believed every ornament carried hope into another family's home. Natalie looked around the workshop with the same quiet respect she had shown every part of the house. Instead of focusing on what had aged, she noticed what had endured. She carefully examined the adjoining wall with a moisture scanner before kneeling near the baseboards. The readings were higher than expected. Moisture had spread farther than the damaged ceiling suggested. She explained everything patiently, pointing out where temporary reinforcement would be needed, and which sections could be preserved without replacing the original craftsmanship. While tracing one wall, her flashlight caught the edge of an old storage cabinet built into the corner. One of its doors would not close completely. When she gently pulled it open, several wooden boxes slid forward. I recognized them immediately. They contained unfinished ornaments my mother had planned to complete one Christmas but never did. Natalie carefully lifted the top box onto the workbench. Beneath it rested a bundle of rolled design sketches tied together, with a faded red ribbon. I untied the ribbon slowly. My mother's familiar handwriting covered every page with notes about future collections she had dreamed of creating. Then something unexpected slipped free and landed gently beside my hand. It was an envelope sealed years ago. Across the front, written in careful blue ink, were 3 words that instantly stole my breath. Natalie Brooks. Neither of us spoke. Natalie stared at the envelope with genuine confusion before looking back at me. I have never seen that before, she whispered. I believed her immediately. The date written beneath her name was 12 years earlier, long before either of us could have imagined standing together inside this room. Questions crowded my mind all at once. How did my mother know her name? Why had she written this letter? Why had she hidden it here without ever mentioning it to me? Before either of us could say another word, my phone vibrated with an emergency weather alert. A powerful coastal snowstorm had changed direction unexpectedly. Heavy snowfall and dangerous wind conditions were expected to reach Bellwether before nightfall, and local officials advised everyone to avoid travel after sunset. Natalie looked toward the window where thick gray clouds were already rolling across the harbor. Then she quietly folded the unopened envelope back into my hands. Whatever answers are inside, she said, they can wait until we are safe. Outside, the first large snowflakes began drifting past the glass, and I had the unmistakable feeling that the storm approaching our little town was about to change far more than the weather. The storm arrived faster than anyone in Bellwether expected. Within an hour, the harbor had disappeared behind swirling sheets of snow, and the wind rattled every window in Carter Christmas House as though winter itself wanted to come inside. Natalie checked the latest road report on her phone before quietly shaking her head. Every highway leading out of town had been closed. The small inn near the harbor had already lost power, and the volunteer emergency shelter was nearly full with stranded travelers. She slipped her phone back into her coat pocket and looked at me with an apologetic smile. I think I am officially staying longer than either of us planned. I surprised myself by answering before I had time to second-guess the words. There is a guest room upstairs. It has not been used in years, but the heater still works. Relief crossed her face, followed immediately by gratitude. Thank you, Evelyn. I promise I will be out of your way the moment the roads reopen. We carried her overnight bag upstairs while snow piled against the windows below. My apartment felt strangely unfamiliar with another person walking through it. The hallway held family photographs, old Christmas cards, and shelves filled with books my mother had collected over decades. Natalie paused beside a framed photograph of my parents decorating the town square many years earlier. Your mother had a beautiful smile, she said softly. She smiled most when she was making something with her hands, I answered. The guest room overlooked the frozen harbor. I opened the curtains and watched snow erase the horizon until sea and sky blended into the same quiet shade of white. Natalie thanked me again before setting her bag beside the bed with the careful movements of someone who never wanted to become an inconvenience. Downstairs we decided the workshop could not wait until the storm ended. We spent the afternoon carrying damp ornaments into the warm showroom, separating fragile wooden pieces with soft towels, and placing small fans wherever the floor remained wet. Natalie explained every temporary repair, while making certain I understood each step instead of simply telling me what to do. She believed I deserved to know how my own house could heal. Somewhere between lifting heavy boxes and stacking drying racks, we reached for the same carved snowflake at exactly the same moment. Our hands touched for only an instant. Neither of us spoke. The warmth of that brief contact lingered much longer than it should have. Later I found one of my mother's old wool sweaters folded inside a cedar chest. It was far too large for me but looked as though it might fit Natalie comfortably. I offered it without much thought. She slipped it on over her sweater and laughed quietly when the sleeves covered part of her hands. It smells like cedar and cinnamon, she said. I smiled. That is probably because my mother stored everything with cedar blocks and dried cinnamon sticks. The scent makes every winter feel like home. She looked around the room before answering. I think I understand that now. As evening settled over the house, I prepared a simple dinner of vegetable soup, fresh bread, and hot tea. We carried our bowls into the workshop because neither of us wanted to stop organizing the ornaments for very long. The unfinished angel rested safely on the workbench between us. Natalie studied it for a long moment before asking why I had never completed it. I stared at the rough wooden wings catching the soft glow from a nearby lamp. Because finishing it would have meant believing I still had another chapter to live, I admitted. After everything that happened, I stopped believing I knew who I was supposed to become. Natalie did not offer empty reassurance. She simply reached for another damp ornament and began gently drying it with a clean cloth. Sometimes unfinished things are not waiting because they are forgotten, she said quietly. Sometimes they are waiting because they deserve the right ending. Outside, the wind continued covering Bellwether beneath fresh snow. Inside, surrounded by warm light, cedar, cinnamon, and hundreds of handmade ornaments drying one careful piece at a time, I realized that for the first time in many years, I was no longer carrying the silence alone. That night the storm settled over Bellwether with a quiet determination that made the whole town feel suspended between yesterday and tomorrow. The wind no longer howled against the windows. Instead, it whispered across the old glass in slow, steady breaths while snow continued covering the streets beneath a blanket of white. The power flickered once before the backup generator quietly took over. The lights dimmed for only a moment, leaving the workshop glowing with the warm amber light of two small lamps and the gentle reflections from the Christmas tree downstairs. Natalie spread the restoration drawings across my mother's workbench, while I poured fresh tea into two mismatched mugs that had survived countless holiday seasons. Neither of us hurried to speak. The silence had become comfortable, the kind that no longer demanded filling. We continued sorting ornaments one careful piece at a time. Every carved angel, every wooden star, every tiny reindeer seemed to carry fingerprints from another December long before either of us stood there together. After several minutes, Natalie looked toward the sealed envelope resting beside the unfinished angel. "I have been thinking about that letter all evening," she admitted quietly. "So have I." I picked it up, turning it over in my hands. The paper had yellowed with age, but the handwriting remained unmistakably my mother's. I broke the seal carefully. Inside was a single handwritten letter folded around an old photograph. My heart stopped the moment I saw it. The picture showed my mother standing beside a much younger Natalie at a preservation conference, both of them smiling in front of a display featuring handcrafted Christmas ornaments. I looked up in surprise. Natalie stared at the photograph as though she had forgotten it existed. "I remember that day," she whispered. "Your mother invited me to lunch after the conference. She wanted to show me photographs of this house." My eyes returned to the letter. My mother explained that she had admired Natalie's work restoring historic buildings and hoped one day she might help transform Carter Christmas House into a community workshop where children could learn traditional woodworking and ornament carving. She wrote that Natalie reminded her of someone who understood that preserving a place also meant preserving the people connected to it. At the bottom of the page, my mother thanked Natalie for listening, even though she understood that life might lead them in different directions. I lowered the letter slowly. "Why did you never tell me?" Natalie took a slow breath before answering. "Because I never came. I accepted another project instead. It was larger, more prestigious, and I convinced myself there would always be another chance to visit your mother later." There was not. Her voice remained calm, but I could hear years of quiet regret beneath every word. "When your insurance company called last week, I asked them to assign this project to me. I wanted to finish something I should have started years ago." The room suddenly felt smaller. I understood why she had come, yet the truth carried an unexpected ache. For several long moments neither of us spoke. I wondered whether she had stayed because of me or because of a promise she believed she still owed my mother. She seemed to understand the question before I could ask it. "Evelyn, I came because of your mother. I stayed because every day I spent here reminded me that this house is still alive." Then she looked directly into my eyes with a quiet honesty that made it impossible to look away. "And somewhere along the way I realized you are the reason it still feels that way." My heartbeat became almost painfully loud. I wanted to answer, but fear arrived before courage. I lowered my eyes toward the unfinished angel resting between us. Outside, snow continued falling in perfect silence, while inside I realized that sometimes the hardest part of healing is not believing another person can care about you. It is believing you deserve to be cared about at all. The storm finally began to lose its strength the following afternoon. Pale sunlight slipped through the clouds, turning the snow outside into a field of quiet silver. Bellwether remained almost completely still. Snowplows had not yet reached our street, and the harbor looked frozen beneath a blanket of white that stretched all the way to the distant lighthouse. Natalie checked the latest road conditions on her phone before placing it back into her pocket without saying anything. I knew what the silence meant before she spoke. The roads would reopen soon. We spent the morning finishing temporary repairs exactly as she had planned. Together we reinforced shelving, moved restored ornaments back into their display cases, and covered damaged sections of the workshop until permanent repairs could begin. Every task seemed ordinary, Yet every shared moment carried a quiet awareness that our borrowed time was slowly coming to an end. Around noon there was a gentle knock on the front door. Mrs. Sullivan, who owned the bakery across the street, stood outside holding 2 large trays of cinnamon rolls. Behind her were several neighbors wearing heavy winter coats and carrying toolboxes, extension cords, and folding tables. Someone had heard the storm stranded us. Someone else had heard the shop needed help. Before I could even invite them inside, people were already clearing snow from the entrance, drying storage boxes, polishing display shelves, and restringing Christmas lights across the front windows. Natalie moved naturally among them, organizing small tasks without ever making anyone feel ordered around. She thanked every volunteer by name after hearing it only once. Watching her reminded me that leadership did not have to be loud. Sometimes it simply looked like helping people believe they mattered. By late afternoon the showroom looked alive again. Children from the neighborhood wandered inside carrying paper snowflakes they had made at home while waiting for the storm to end. One little girl noticed the unfinished angel resting on my mother's workbench and quietly asked why it did not have wings yet. I smiled sadly before I could answer. Natalie knelt beside her and said, "Sometimes beautiful things need a little more time before they are ready to fly." The little girl nodded as though that explanation made perfect sense, then returned to hanging paper stars in the front window. I looked at Natalie and she gave me the smallest smile. Somehow she always found the words I had been searching for. As evening settled over Bellwether, our neighbors slowly returned home, leaving behind warm food, repaired displays, and laughter that still seemed to linger inside the old house. We switched off the overhead lights until only the Christmas tree illuminated the showroom with soft golden light. Holiday music drifted quietly from an old radio near the staircase. Natalie stood beside the tree adjusting one crooked ornament while I folded the last tablecloth. When she turned toward me, the room suddenly felt much smaller. We stood only a few feet apart. I noticed a tiny fleck of white paint near her temple, left over from repairing one of the display shelves. Without thinking, I reached up and brushed it away with my fingertips. My hand lingered for only a heartbeat. She did not step back. Her eyes searched mine with the same quiet honesty that had slowly become familiar over the past few days. I felt my breath catch as she moved a little closer. Neither of us spoke. The distance between us became almost impossibly small. For one fragile moment I believed the rest of the world had disappeared. Then her phone vibrated sharply inside her coat pocket. She closed her eyes for the briefest second before answering. I turned away, pretending to straighten a ribbon on the tree while she listened in silence. When the call ended, she remained standing perfectly still. Finally she spoke, her voice gentle but weighted with something I immediately feared. The California restoration project confirmed my start date this morning. They expect me immediately after Christmas. I stared at the lights reflected across the front window, unable to find the right words. Everything inside me wanted to ask her not to go. Instead I quietly nodded because sometimes the deepest feelings hide behind the smallest gestures. Outside, the first snowplow finally rolled past Carter Christmas house, clearing the road that would soon carry Natalie away from the place where my heart had only just begun remembering how to hope. Christmas Eve arrived with a sky so clear it almost seemed impossible to believe the storm had existed at all. Fresh snow covered Bellwether in a quiet layer of white that reflected the early morning light like polished glass. I watched Natalie load her equipment into the back of her sport utility vehicle, while pretending to organize display ornaments near the front window. Every movement felt painfully ordinary. She folded her measuring tripod, closed the tailgate, brushed snow from the windshield. Life has a cruel way of making the hardest moments look completely normal. She walked back inside one final time to leave the completed restoration report on the front counter. Every page was marked with careful notes, detailed drawings, and practical solutions that could preserve Carter Christmas house without sacrificing its history. She had given my home a future even though she believed she would not be part of it. I thanked her quietly. She smiled, but the warmth in her eyes carried the same sadness I felt inside my own heart. After she stepped outside again, I looked toward the unfinished angel resting on my mother's workbench. For several long moments I simply stared at it. Then I picked up my carving knife for the first time in almost 2 years. My hands trembled so much that I nearly set the tool back down. Instead I took one careful cut, then another. Cedar filled the air with the familiar scent that had once defined every December of my childhood. Hour after hour passed while soft curls of wood gathered across the workbench. By the time afternoon sunlight reached the workshop window, the angel finally had graceful wings, gentle hands, and a peaceful expression that reminded me of my mother's quiet smile. I sanded every edge, polished the wood with natural oil, and placed the finished figure inside a handcrafted cedar box lined with soft linen. Beneath it I tucked a small handwritten note that simply read, "Thank you for reminding me that unfinished does not mean forgotten." I carried the box to the town antique shop before walking another block to the small cafe where Natalie had stopped for coffee while waiting for the roads to clear completely. She looked surprised when I entered. Without saying much, I placed the wrapped box in front of her. "This belongs with someone who understands how to protect beautiful things," I said softly. Natalie looked at me with quiet emotion before carefully accepting the gift. She did not open it. She only rested both hands on the box as though she already understood its weight. "Evelyn, I do not know how to thank you." I smiled gently because gratitude was easier than honesty. "You already have." We walked back toward Carter Christmas house together through softly falling snow. Neither of us hurried. Neither of us tried to change what both of us believed was about to happen. Outside the front steps she stopped beside her vehicle. For several long seconds we simply stood there, letting the cold air fill the silence between us. Finally she stepped closer until only a small space remained. Her forehead rested lightly against mine, and I closed my eyes without thinking. I could feel the warmth of her breath and the quiet steadiness of her heartbeat through the heavy winter coat separating us. She did not kiss me. I did not ask her to stay. Some moments become unforgettable precisely because they remain unfinished. She whispered that meeting me had changed more than she knew how to explain. I wanted to tell her she had done the same for me, but the words refused to leave my heart. Instead I watched her climb into the driver's seat. The engine started. The tires rolled slowly across the fresh snow. I stood on the front steps until her vehicle disappeared beyond the curve leading out of town. Only then did I return inside and notice the developer's contract still waiting where I had left it days earlier. I picked it up, intending to sign at last, but something slipped from the folded papers onto the floor. It was another envelope in my mother's handwriting that I had somehow overlooked before. My name was written across the front. As I slowly opened it, I realized that everything I believed about the future of this house, and perhaps even about the woman who had just driven away, was about to change forever. My mother's letter began with the same careful handwriting I had watched fill Christmas cards every December of my childhood. "My dearest Evelyn, if you are reading this, then you have finally reached the moment when you believe choosing the future might feel like betraying the past. Never will. Loving what comes next does not erase what came before." I read every word slowly while morning sunlight spilled across the workshop floor. She wrote that Carter Christmas house had never been meant to become a museum preserving memories behind locked doors. She dreamed of laughter, new hands learning old skills, children discovering the joy of making something beautiful with patience and kindness. Near the end of the letter she revealed something I had never known. The developer had promised to preserve the house only until the sale was completed. After that, most of the original workshop would be removed to create luxury guest suites. My mother had quietly investigated the proposal years earlier and left copies of the documents inside the same envelope. She had known that someday I might face this decision. She ended with one final sentence that settled gently into my heart. "Do not protect my memories by sacrificing your own future. Build something I never had the chance to see." I folded the letter against my chest and looked around the workshop. For the first time since my mother died, I understood that I had not been honoring her by refusing to move forward. I had only been hiding inside yesterday. I called the developer immediately and declined the offer. He sounded disappointed but wished me well before ending the conversation. The silence afterward felt lighter than it had in years. Then I remembered the cedar box resting in Natalie's hands. Without allowing myself another excuse, I grabbed my coat, locked the front door, and drove toward the highway. About 30 miles outside Bellwether, I spotted her sport utility vehicle parked beside a quiet roadside cafe overlooking a frozen river. She stood outside holding the unfinished angel I had finally completed. When she saw me, surprise crossed her face before slowly giving way to hope. I walked toward her until only a few steps remained between us. "I read my mother's letter," I said softly. She smiled without speaking, as though she already knew that everything had changed. I shook my head. No. Everything finally became clear. I told her about the documents, about refusing the sale, and about my mother's last wish. Natalie listened with tears shining quietly in her eyes. Then she opened the cedar box completely and showed me my own note resting beneath the angel. "I almost kept driving," she admitted. "But I stopped because your gift reminded me that unfinished things deserve another chance. I need to tell you something too. Last night, before I ever left Bellwether, I called California and declined the project. I was afraid staying would only make your decision harder if you were choosing me because you felt grateful instead of because you truly wanted me in your life." I stepped closer until our hands met naturally between us. "Gratitude brought you into my life," I whispered. "Love is asking you to stay." She closed her fingers gently around mine, and for the first time neither of us held anything back behind silence. We drove home together through snow-covered roads that no longer looked like an ending. Over the following months the workshop slowly came alive again. Children gathered every Saturday to carve ornaments beside the same windows where my mother had once stood. Natalie transformed the upstairs rooms into a preservation studio where forgotten pieces of local history found new life. I finished more than the angel. I finished believing that my own hand still had something worth creating. 1 year later, the completed angel hung proudly in the front window of Carter Christmas House, catching the warm glow of Christmas lights every evening. Visitors often stopped to admire it without knowing the story hidden inside its wings. Whenever I looked at it, I no longer saw everything I had lost. I saw the life we had chosen to build together. Sometimes the greatest miracle is not finding someone who changes your heart. Sometimes it is finding someone who quietly reminds you that your heart was never beyond saving, only waiting for the courage to begin again.